And this will change soon. There's me. There I am. All right, there we go. Okay, so today we're going to talk about side chaining. If you've ever watched a video on YouTube about side chaining using a compressor, there's a thing that I always want them to do in the video that they never do, and they never go completely crazy with the side chain to show you what it's really doing and just the extent of the sort of effect that you can have with it. So let me pull up our chats here, and then we're going to get right into doing just that thing. Okay, so let's look here. What I've got on this bass channel right here, if I go and hit Alt-3, I've just got whole notes. That's it. Just whole notes playing, okay? So what we're going to do with that is we're going to use a side chain to completely wreck that signal. Check this out. Watch what's going to happen now once I've enabled that side chain. And we've got our settings here. And you're going to see that this doesn't look anything like the bass. Check this out. Let's get even dumber with it. We'll get an infinite. Hear it glitching now? Alright, so now that you've seen what the side chain does to the bass signal, the thing that they never show you in the videos, let's get to the thing that everybody talks about. What is a side chain? It's just using a different source to control a compressor than the thing that you're going to apply the compressor to. So in this case, we are going to use the compressor to affect the bass. Clearly, you've seen how that worked. We were affecting the bass quite a bit there. But we saw what the bass was doing without the compressor. It's just whole notes. Just whole notes happening there. That's all the bass is doing. So why is it going berserk when I turn that side chain back on? So normally what a compressor does is your input signal, when it crosses over a threshold, which you can see the level coming in here, when your signal crosses over a threshold, the compressor will reduce it by a certain ratio, which you can see here, and then output that. What that does, if you look at the bass, I've changed this to be only a 24 dB scale. Let me see if 12 will work for our purposes. If I turn it up loud enough, it might. Let's kill this. 12 isn't going to work. Let's go back to 24 here. Okay, so you can see bass is a very peaky instrument. When you pluck the string on the bass, and this is a very, very fake sounding plucked bass. It's got a really aggressive pluck. We talked last time about using the compressor to tame that. What we're going to do now is tame it and wreck it. So when we go like this, look at how hot that is. Let's take a look at these levels. I'm still learning Cakewalk. I'm not gonna worry about our release times or anything, but you can see it gets really high when the pick attack hits, and then immediately after that it drops off a lot. What that means is your actual sustain of your note is much lower than your attack. Your attack is going to be super hot, and then it's going to drop down quite a bit when you get to the meat of the note. Watch it. You'll see it happen. See how that spike is hitting up between -9 and -6, right? So you can see that happening right here. But the actual sustain is really more like down in this range, right? If I just hit a note, let me see if I'm on the right instrument here. There we go. Now, some of that, how it's tapering off slowly, is just the delay on the meter itself. But you can hear how as soon as I hit hit the note, you hear the plucky attack. And hear how much the sustain drops. That's an issue because in the digital realm, we have a hard ceiling. We can't go over 0. Once we hit 0 dB, we start to clip and it gets real nasty and bad things happen. You get quantization errors and all sorts of things. So what if the bass isn't loud enough? You can't turn it up. If the peak is hitting the ceiling, but the meat of the note is at minus 15 dB, you can't turn your bass any louder effectively than minus 15. So what we need to do is clamp down on those peaks a little. Now, normally what you would do about that is you would just use a compressor and have the source take care of that. Now, we could do that in addition to doing the sidechain shenanigans we're about to pull. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this send and I'm going to remove it so that you can see what's going on. Okay, so now this compressor now should behave normally. There we go. And you can see how when you look at this, you see the peak hit, right? But our meat of our note is sitting at minus 18. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to sit our threshold where the meat of the note is. And whenever that peak comes through, take a look over at this output meter. See how you still see a peak, you still see an attack, but the overall level is sitting much more well behaved. So that's what the compressor does, okay? And what it's doing is just taking our input from the bass, and it's applying a volume change to it. It's just turning the volume down. I should be using Nova or some other dynamic EQ or multiband compressor for ducking bass behind kicks. Susums, were you here a minute ago? Because wait till you see what we're gonna do with it. Because what we're gonna do is we're gonna get freaky with it again. All right, let me show you. So what I'm gonna do over here in Cakewalk, every DAW does this a little differently. In Cakewalk, if I create a send over here, you see I've got my buses, and this Sonitus Effects compressor has a side input. Expand 2 is the synthesizer that bass is coming from. So I'm going to create a send. Now, this kick drum, okay, so let's mute the bass, and let's just listen to the kick drum and see what the kick drum's doing. Okay, so you hear the bass, and we can see that now the bass is coming and controlling this right here. Okay, now we're getting into what every video on YouTube about sidechaining shows you. Is they say, okay, well, you might want to use a sidechain to come from the bass, and you're going to come from the kick drum, and you're going to duck the bass under it, right? And you see how there's this subtle effect where now the bass is clearing a path for the kick drum. Yeah, man, not really. Do you really hear that? I mean, it's happening. I can see the meters telling me it's happening. But let's make this demonstration a little more effective, shall we? Let's really clamp down on it. And we're going to have a really short attack. And check this out. So now I've turned the volume all the way down on the bass. We want this to be pre-fader. Okay, so this is sending out to the sidechain input regardless of where my fader is, okay? So check this out. So now you hear how wacky that's got. So where that's coming from is the kick drum. So now that you can see the bass acting like it's just kick drum phobic, it is afraid of that kick drum now. Every time the kick drum hits, this sidechain compressor is causing it to go whoop, 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 like super underneath. Listen to them together now. Now, kick drum and bass, people will usually use together, and you'll hear again every time you look at a sidechaining video or a tutorial, they'll tell you, you know, you use the kick drum to trigger the side chain on the bass. Why? Why would you do that? Remember what I just said a few minutes ago about the bass and how peaky it is. You know what the peakiest instrument in your mix is going to be your kick drum, because the kick drum is nothing but a hard hit with no decay. It just drops off immediately. So your kick drum is just, you know, listen to it without the bass here. Tick, 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 tick. It doesn't get more spiky than that, more peaky. There's no sustain. So what happens when you have, for example, the kick drum and the bass hitting notes at the same time, which guess what the bass and the kick drum do together a lot? They hit together all the time. So if you have the kick and the bass hitting together, you're going to create a big spike, and you're going to see that on your master output. Let me change this one to a 24 dB range again. So this is our master out. That's the physical output. We can set that to 24 as well. Normally I like the 48 dB, but we're going to go to a little, or 42, sorry. Normally I like that, but we want to go a little bit smaller range so we can see these more accurately. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to disable that, and let's just look at what's happening, okay? The bass. You see when, on those whole notes, when the bass hits, it's plunking up there at -6. You get all that I'm saying? When you sidechain the kick, you should leave the mids of the bass alone. Oh, only sidechain the low bound. Yeah. What Susum's here is telling you is right. You should only maybe use it on the low end of your bass. Yeah, let me talk about that in just a second. So when we get to over here, what he's saying is this is making a radical cut to the bass. And like he says, the bass is constantly disappearing. Normally you don't want that. But today what we're doing is showing some really goofy things we can do with the sidechain. So if you don't want to have your bass constantly just vanishing, what you would do is you would apply an EQ in between here so that you could only affect the low part of your bass signal so that the mids are still there and the highs, because where it gets really spiky is in the low end. Also in the kind of high end where the pick hits, that depends on the bass. If it's a finger bass or a synthesizer, you may not have a high end to be concerned about. But yeah, what Ty is asking about there is you don't usually want to have settings that are this extreme. But today we're doing wacky things, so we want it to disappear. So why does that happen anyway? That's what I was originally getting at, is you have this bass and it's hitting up here. Those attacks are hitting like -6. Let's turn off that send. And so now the bass, the compression is just on its own. Let's turn it off. Okay, so with no compression, our kick and our bass we're not seeing the bass on the master bus because it's going through drums here. I really need to route. Yeah, that's going through master. Really slamming that output. So what we want to do is use compression to keep those things under control. So in our case, if we wanted to use less extreme settings so that it's not disappearing, we could start this back up. normally you also wouldn't have this sort of thing going on while your bass is playing whole notes. You would usually have the bass doing some other things. And you would normally use it just like they do in every video you've ever looked at with sidechaining. Normally you would use much more subtle settings because you don't want your bass to get sucked completely out. On the other hand, what if it wasn't a bass? Let's take this bass synth here and open this guy up. What if instead of full pick bass, what if we're looking at something more like that? Now what's going to happen when we get Alt 2? Yes, Alt 2. Let's have a look at this thing. Now let's turn the volume down on the kick so we can really hear what it's doing to it. Now, here's the thing that I also never see anybody talk about is you don't have to have this kick be a thing. We've got this pad that has no sort of dynamics there. What do we do if we want that to maybe have dubstep wobbles in it? Or if we just want it to go down and have some sort of rhythmic pulse? You can use the sidechain to create that. So let's create a send here on the snare drum. And we're going to send that. So first off, let's just solo the snare drum and listen to what the pattern is. And now we can look at this and see what sort of an effect the snare drum is going to have on that. Now, this still says bass, but it's that synth now. So let's solo the synth, turn the volume down on this, set it to pre-fader. And all of a sudden, now we have this very rhythmic sound. And you could create that with an instrument that you're not even actually going to ever put in the mix. Why does no one ever mention that? That's a great use for a sidechain right there. We could create a separate drum track and do nothing with it but create the dynamics for this track that otherwise would be lacking them. And you see how we can take this attack, and let's watch what happens here. Notice by slowing down the attack, we've made it less crazy. We've made it a much more well-behaved sort of an effect. But that's not what I want to do today. I want to make it stupid. So let's go extremely short attack. Let's make it glitch out and see what happens. And you hear now it's completely sucking all the air out of that thing. Now, let's say we want to actually hear the snare drum in that mix. The rhythm makes not a lot of sense without the kick drum as well. Let's undo our solos here and just bring everything up. And you can hear this, clearly I did not have this in mind when I sequenced this stuff. That's okay. We're not trying to be super musical today. Today we're just looking at what the sidechain actually accomplishes. And hopefully you're seeing what's really going on with this. Let's take this and make it even a little more of an obvious sort of thing. So this bass here, let's pull up our synth again. And let's get something, synth basses. what I would really like is something like just a plain square wave, something along those lines. Synth basses, multi-timbral, soft leads, smooth square. There we go, smooth square. That's good. Let's kill off it's interesting, the echo must be built into that somehow. Where is that at? There we go. Let's kill the delay. So now we just have just a mono square wave. Check out how cool of an effect we can get with that. And then I kind of want to come off of that, and let's look at the cymbals. Okay, so you hear what the cymbals are doing. Let's run those into the sidechain. Another thing I never see people do that can be used to great effect. Because check out what happens with the cymbal crashes. Now we've got this cool backwards effect every time a cymbal hits. Whenever you hear a crash especially. And a side effect of that is by chaining those two sounds together. You may not notice it as much in the mix, but by chaining those two together, hear how poppy and punchy those cymbals became. Because what's happening now is the air getting sucked out of that square wave is creating a contrast, and it's creating space for those cymbals to come out. You'll do the same thing when you're playing an instrument. When you're playing guitar, a lot of times you'll play half notes so that you have your chung, pa, and when the snare hits, you cut off, and you kill your sound so that that snare pop really cuts through. So what happens now? Let's unmute things. Now notice, excuse me. This groove is awful. Notice it's ducking that down. And you'll hear this called ducking, especially if you ever talk to broadcasters. This is one of those things. You'll hear it ducking that down every time there's a cymbal hit. Let's get rid of that, and we'll put it back on our kick drum, where you would more typically see it. There we go. Yeah, and this is one of those things that a sidechain compressor it's one of the weird things that for some reason it's kind of mystifying to a lot of audio guys especially when you're first starting out. The thing is, it's super common for, if you ever talk to anybody who's in broadcasting about a ducking compressor, they'll look at you like, of course, we learned that on day one. That's their bread and butter. Because if you have, for example, if you have a music bed that people need to talk over, what you'll do is run all of the microphones into a bus and then have that bus control this. So as soon as somebody talks, the music bed comes down. And then you'll usually set a fairly long release so that when people stop talking, it takes a little bit before the compressor lets go of it. You might soften the attack a little bit so that it isn't as obvious that the music has gone squish as soon as someone starts talking. But then you'll let it come back kind of slowly, go out kind of slowly. But it's a great way to just shave a couple of dB off of your music bed every time someone talks without having to do that manually. Because if you had to fader ride and predict when anybody's going to talk, or how loud they're going to be. You know, good luck with that. It's okay to do that on a pre-recorded thing in retrospect, but when you're talking about live broadcasting, what you want to do is have people talking over a music bed and not have to mess with it in real time. You want it to take care of itself as much as possible. Now, notice how we're using this today, because I just feel like going crazy with the thing today. We're using it to create some really radical, spectacular effects. That's not the normal case. Most of the time, you're going to be a lot more subtle with it. So we've got it back now. We've got our square wave here, and we've got it back chained to our kick drum. So let's turn the kick drum down. Only have the important tracks here playing. And you hear that attack is creating that little bit of a click. We can just slow the attack down. And then we can change the ratio. Notice if I do that, see how that line goes up? What that's actually going to do, sorry, watch your speakers, it's going to make it get louder every time the kick hits. That is called a side-chained expander as opposed to a side-chained compressor. So what we're doing now is we're expanding the dynamic range instead of compressing it. What a neat thing to do. There are two ways in music to accent something. When you are playing a support role, you can accent the lead role by hitting exactly with them, but under, in order to push them forward, or you can accent by being silent and letting them stand alone. Those are the two ways to draw attention to a thing, is to either point at it or to make it be the only thing in the room. So if everybody in the room points at something, everybody goes, oh, hey, we should look at that thing that everyone's pointing at. Likewise, if there's only one thing in the room to look at, people will look at that thing. This is the expansion thing. And remember, our square wave is just playing whole notes. All of this dynamic stuff is coming from the kick drum. So let's bring the kick back in. And again, in this case, the kick drum is part of a groove. It doesn't have to be. You could be using this track and never have the volume come up. You could never use that in the song if you wanted to. We could go back and use a different kick drum and just have it just stomping out quarter notes if we wanted. This is the kind of thing you can get accomplished using a sidechain, and there's not really any other way. Now, as far as the technical way of doing this in Cakewalk, this Sonitus effects compressor comes with Cakewalk. It's part of it, so go with it. Use it. If you want, stick an EQ before it. You can create an effects chain if you want. But the way to get into that is to create a send over here on whatever your source is, and then just create the send and send it to the Sonitus effects side input. It'll handle everything else for you automatically. You don't have to worry about turning the sidechain on or off or doing anything. It's real easy to do. So let's look at this with the groove going. The groove originally had eighth notes on the hi-hats. I cut those out so that I could use them, for example, later on. So let's check out what happens using this as an expander. So notice how we're using some extreme settings, making this thing just drop completely out. You've heard that in music before. You'll hear people using that on the kick and the snare. Here's the thing. I almost never do this. I don't like that sound. It's too much. I don't like the sound of an overly compressed sort of a mix, like where the kick and the snare are real compressed and well behaved. I like them to get a little gnarly. So this is one of those things, if for some reason you're interested in creating the type of sounds that you hear me make, you probably won't do this much. But on the other hand, if you want to get that sound where you have these things pumping and shifting, this is how you do it. You get your sidechain in and you squish a high ratio every time the kick drum or whatever source you want to use comes on, and then just let it slam the door on the input. A more typical sort of setting would be something where our ratio is smaller, like 2 or 4 to 1. Notice how now you'll see the volume changing as it goes, but you'll notice as the volume rises, it's not clamping it down as much. Now also, see how our source here, let's bring this up. And then let's change this synth one last time. Oh, give me synth basses. Notice when you look at the level on that. Bam, that is solid. Nothing moves that. And then when we start playing with the dynamics here, well, if you could hear it, let's and of course you hear how it's cutting off all those attacks. This is just the kind of crazy stuff you can do with a sidechain. Let's jack that ratio down again and bring this down here. Notice now it's just ducking out of the way of the kick drum. Not nearly as radical. Nothing real crazy happening there. Now, Now, what happens if we get real stupid? What is happening now? Let's listen to it without the other sources. And notice how now we're using that to clamp down a little more. Let's make it a little more subtle. And remember, the actual part that the bass is playing is just this. Notice how now it's not chopping it up quite so much. That's more typical of what you would see, just enough to cut some attack off whenever the drums are popping out. Like I said, personally, I'm not as much into that. I'd prefer to process each one with its own compressor. But if you wanna have the bass sort of getting out of the way of certain things, or if you wanted to create a synth that got out of the way of certain things, or if you're using a music bed and you need to have it mute when there's dialogue, this is the way you do that. You just route from a drum or from some other source and into whatever you want to compress. What happens now if we take this? Let's get rid of this. What happens if we stick this, for example, let's say we stick this on the kick drum. Now, normally what you do with a kick drum compressor is just set it sort of up at the top to kind of keep the peaks from being too crazy, to keep all of the peaks roughly the same level, so it's predictable and easier to work with. If you've got some kick drums peaking up at -6 and others peaking at -18, you may find that you have trouble getting your mix to not clip at inappropriate times, or you may have to use a lot of bus compression or a lot of master bus compression. And, you probably don't want to do that. So you want to put some compression on your kick. Now, what kind of stupid stuff can we get into now if we start adding that and having, for example, the bass compress the kick? You're probably never going to do this, because what happens is now your kick is just going to vanish whenever the bass drum hits. Let's turn this down. We'll set this to pre-fader so that it ignores that. Now, remember, our bass is playing that. So why aren't we hearing anything? Well, because the bass is playing long, sustained notes. What if we take that off of here? And what if we grab the cymbals? Now watch what happens. It's a lot more subtle, but basically what's going on is every time there's a cymbal hit, that kick is going to be quiet. Hear the kicks being all painfully quiet now? Until that cymbal rings out. Let's listen to the source so you can hear why it's happening. Hear the rides. They're just destroying that poor kick drum. So anyway, hopefully now you understand exactly what the sidechain is doing. You can see how it can be used for good or for awesome or for evil. You can use it just to clear a little space to create a subtle effect so that you're not so that there's room for other instruments to pop out at certain points in the mix. You can use it to control your peaks for peak limiting so that you're not going to have to crank everything down on a master bus compressor. You can use it to create rhythms from a track that previously was just nothing but boo. You can use it to do that. There are all kinds of cool things you can do with it. And hopefully this video, or this, if you're watching on the live stream, hopefully this has shown you what you can do with it and some different things. Real quick, I want to mention that I am doing this as part of our Patreon. Let me pull it up real quick. So you can see the reason I'm able to do these videos every week is because of the Patreon at the Grammar Club. If you would like to become part of this and help support us, this is where you should do it, at patreon.com/thegrammarclub. We would love that. I'm going to continue doing these sort of streams and videos for the foreseeable future, and that's something I'm able to do because I can have my afternoons off. Thanks to our patrons giving us dollars, which is wonderful. So we would like to thank them very much for what they do, and hopefully we're providing some useful content for all of you guys. That's it for today. Hopefully you understand how the sidechaining works a little better now. Feel free to comment below. Let us know if there's anything you would like to know, if you'd like to see me do in a future video, if there's any questions you have about this one. We would love to chat back with you and answer whatever questions you might have. I am Ailsean from the Grammar Club, and I will see you later.